Well, hello, welcome to the Nothing is Wasted podcast. My name is Davey. I'm one of your hosts, and I'm so grateful that you are joining with us today for this episode. It is a wonderful conversation with Cameron Lee Small, and I'll tell you this: this one is personally interesting to me. This conversation was Cameron Lee Small was born in Korea, and then he was relinquished into foster care at age 3, obviously South Korea, and then adopted in 1984 to a family in the United States. And now he has a private practice called Therapy Redeemed, which specializes in the mental health needs of adoptees and their families, no matter where they're at on their adoption journey. And so the reason this particular conversation was so intriguing to me, first of all, was because my mother-in-law, Christy's mom, was adopted out of an orphanage from Seoul, South Korea, when she was 10 years old. And so that's just part of our own family's journey and our own family of origin. And then I've also had a lot of conversations recently with adoption parents, adoption families, and just kind of talking about their surprise about the trauma that they were going to be experiencing. Like, it's one thing to understand this, but I just said that sounded so informal, but you know what? This is the Nothing is Wasted podcast that we are just, this is raw and real. It's one thing to understand things theoretically, and I think most adoption families would say that the system tries to prepare you for the kind of trauma these kids have experienced, and there's a varying degree of that, and how it's going to manifest or present itself in your day-to-day life. But most adoption families also say that they could never have been prepared for it. It's one thing to learn it in theory. It's another thing to actually live it out every single day in practice. That's why I love what Cameron Lee Small is doing, because he's helping families as they're navigating this journey, helping them to have an understanding, be more informed about what this looks like for an adoptee, whether it's domestic, whether it's international, no matter what it is. And then also, this is a particularly interesting conversation for those of you who are parenting kids, maybe your own biological kids, who have undergone some kind of trauma. They've lived through and experienced some kind of major transition, something that is going to impact their attachment. And so we get into some of this stuff. And this was also very interesting to me because we are right now in the process of developing. We're in the R&D phase of this process right now, of developing the Pain to Purpose course for kids that would also have parent prompts so that while a parent is going through Pain to Purpose, their child can be going through Pain to Purpose on their level as well. But then there's conversations that can happen across those particular course pathways that really brings the entire family into the Pain to Purpose journey. And so this is just for that reason, I was just so filled up by this conversation. I was so excited about having this conversation with Cameron Lee Small. And there is so much rich information that he shares. It really is helpful and encouraging, especially if you would fall in one of these camps: adoption, fostering, or parenting a child who's experienced trauma. You yourself have experienced trauma. This is just a rich conversation. Cameron wrote a book called The Adoptee's Journey: From Loss and Trauma to Healing and Empowerment. It's an incredible book. We'll put all the links in the show notes or right underneath this YouTube page. Before we dive into my conversation, I want to invite you to join me on our next 5 Steps to Taking Back Your Story Zoom call. It's a live Zoom call I do every single month, where I teach through what I believe are the 5 steps to taking back your story. And again, these are not theory. This is practice. This is something that I have learned through my own healing recovery of losing my wife, Amanda, in 2015 to murder. And then also, as we've been working with and coaching people and pastoring people, the 5 steps I believe everybody is going to have to confront or deal with if they're going to partner with God to take back their story. You can't take back your story by yourself, by the way. You need a supernatural empowerment, but there is a part that God's calling you to play. And that's what we talk about. It's a rich time. It's a Zoom call live. It's not a webinar, so you can have your screen on, you can engage with me, you can ask questions. We always have a Q&A at the end, and typically it's just a really sacred time of ministry too. So I want to invite you to join me on that next Zoom call. Whenever it is, you can find that out at nothingiswasted.com/start here. Again, that's nothingiswasted.com/start here. And it's great for you as we're waking up every single day trying to learn more about how we can meet you in your pain and provide you a pathway through. And this really is a first step or a next step to that pathway through your pain. So nothingiswasted.com/start here. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into my conversation with Cameron Lee Small. Well, Cameron, it's great to have you on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Davey.
Why don't you do this? Why don't you tell us a little bit about you and kind of your life right now? You know, we're absolutely going to make sure that we talk about this book, The Adoptee's Journey, but I really want to do it through the lens of your story, which is very much a part of what this book is about. But I'd love to hear first, what do you do now? What's life like for you, modern day? And then we'll go in reverse and jump back into your story.
Yeah. Well, yeah, again, thanks for having me. Right now, life is kind of wild, just personally, I'll say that. So, have a 20-year-old and doing life in California. And then at home, we've got a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. So just even getting sleep through the night is still kind of it's a win if that happens. And getting the kids out the door. And professionally, then there's the clinic that I launched, my private practice, Therapy Redeemed. So right now, professionally, I serve as a licensed professional clinical counselor based here in the Twin Cities, Minnesota. And just started snowing last night, so there's some fresh stuff on the ground. And a lot of my work is centered on, how can we help make communities a safer, more informed place for vulnerable children and families, and for adoptees, a place of healing, and places where we can talk about just the fullness of what the lived experience of adoption is like. So that means part of my day is one-on-one counseling with clients, and another part is facilitating support or education groups for adult adoptees, teen adoptees, adoptive parents, clinicians, child welfare professionals. And then the final portion is through writing. And so content creation through book, other multimedia platforms. So really a mixture of all of that to help adoptees not feel alone in the fullness of their lived experience.
Man, I love so much what you're doing, both the content that you're creating, but also the practice that you've started to really help to minister to families who are experiencing this. I told you off air that this is part of our lived experience as well, for me, vicariously, in the sense that my wife's mom, so my mother-in-law, was adopted out of an orphanage from Seoul, South Korea when she was 10 years old. And then also the fact that, because of my late wife's, the way she died, and just the fact that she is not here anymore, my wife now has chosen to adopt our son from our previous marriage. And so there's a lot of complexities with that, and there's a lot of different things to navigate. So we're experiencing some of that firsthand, and you're living in it every single day. But it's not just because of the people you're seeing in your office, so to speak, through your clinic, but your own experience. I'd love for you to share a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I was born in South Korea, in Busan, and this was in the 80s. And it always feels important now, as I share my story, to mention some of the context around the 80s in Korea and just globally, that at that time there was this push to really kind of clean up Korea. The Olympics were coming, and the authorities, just the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, were to kind of like, not necessarily, I don't know if the word get rid of, but the quote unquote mixed blood children were sort of a tarnish on Korea's sort of reputation, as well as there was some church influence, and I don't want to say it's bad or good, but the idea of having children out of wedlock or single parenting was not looked at in a favorable way. Meanwhile, in the U.S., we've got adoption agencies like Holt International and just other groups kind of connecting the dots, and it makes sense. We've got folks in the U.S. who desperately and from a good place wanted to parent. And then we've got this other place in the world who also kind of desperately, in a way, they have all of these children, quote unquote, available for adoption. And that's how some of us were labeled in our intake paperwork. So put the two together, and my parents, I lived with them for 3 years. in Busan. And when I was just after my third birthday, my father died. And so my mom is faced with this decision. Not only were they not married, but now she's a single parent in Korea in the 80s. So that spirit of the times kind of enters our household and sort of, and you know, as an adult, when I did meet her finally, I kind of hear more of the story. But people in the community, even in her own family and in the local church, were really kind of pressuring her, or I guess I can say they were influencing her to believe that the best thing for me, Hisong, that's who I was back then, the best thing for Hisong would be for her to place me for international adoption, meaning he'll grow up in a good Christian white family in America, and there's really no other possible way this works out for you or Hisong. So, I mean, she's kind of almost got no options, it seems. And that's, you know, with the adoption professionals and recruiters and just all of that. So I get placed into foster care, 2 foster placements actually. And then 6 months later, they find a match for me in Wisconsin. And so I'm placed onto the airplane, fly over, land at Chicago O'Hare. I kind of handed into my adoptive dad's arms and just terrified. 3.5-year-old toddler. I mean, my son is about to turn 4, and it's just imagining putting him in someone's arms in a different city, different language, even. And I see how he still calls out to me in the middle of the night, "Dada," you know, like that kind of stuff. I was terrified. I jump out of his arms, run back onto the airplane, and so that season, really grappling with the realities of trauma, developmental trauma, and just different forms of that. But back then, that wasn't really a household word.
Right.
Like now it's kind of a buzzword, trauma informed kind of things.
Right.
But back in the 80s, it's like, what's going on? How come he's not sleeping? Why is he running around like this? Why is he crying for hours at a time? You know, feeding issues. And eventually, though, sort of like accepting this is my new situation. And of course, right now I speak, I love my parents, my mom and dad, and they have done so much. And just, you know, the resources and tools that they had at the time, or the limitation of that. Now as a professional, you know, that's part of my work to say, hey, parents who know better do better, kind of idea. But same thing goes with children. So I went through my whole childhood, teenage years, adolescence, emerging adulthood, kind of not really talking about it or knowing how to talk about that. And especially growing up as a racialized minority, really just trying to fit in as much as I could. I mean, you know how it is, like maybe you know how it is just in high school, especially.
Right.
I just want to belong, man. Like, please do not even mention that I'm not from around here. I just want to like be you all, right? And in my mid 20s, I was just, you know, working, and my manager, who's also Korean adoptee, sort of called me into this conversation. He's like, "Yo, Cam, you're Korean, right?" And this was just a few days after we met, and he started sharing with me that he was searching for his birth mom. I didn't even know that you could do that. And in my mind, I was like, "Why would you do that?" And you know, he kind of took me under his wing, just so generous, and just allowing me to think about it from a different camera angle. And one thing led to another. I grew up in the church, but during that time of my life, I was kind of just exploring other life circumstances and perspectives. And I met a pastor, actually. It gave me his business card, and I didn't think anything of it. But during that season, I decided to check it out. And that was the first time I was in community with an Asian American you know, brothers and sisters in Christ. And it was a new world for me, because I grew up in a church that was white, predominantly white, and nothing wrong with white people. But it was just like, wow, Asian people can love Jesus too. And they sing, they have a worship team, and they eat regular food, and they're learning and working. They're graduate students, professors, all of this. And really it was Asian, people who are connected to Asian culture and this sort of like lived experience. They have value and worth to contribute, not only to the kingdom of God, but just to everyday life. And that, to me, it blew my mind, because of all of those years, I grew up with kind of like this internalized sort of like doubt that this part of you, Cam, that was back then. Don't think about it, forget and move on.
Wow.
But this was really a season of challenge to say, but this is part of who you are, Cam. It's part of the fullness of the way that God has kind of made you as an image bearer. So let's explore that together. One thing led to another. I was invited to volunteer at a Korean adoptee camp. And that was the first time that I was introduced to a larger population of adoptees besides just my brother. And hearing these kids, they're like seventh graders all the way up to senior year in high school, ask the same kinds of questions that I had. But they were so open about it because, they were campers and they've come back each year and sitting around the campfire and lots of different emotions represented there. And I was just struck by the openness of it all, the permission of it, that this is here.
Wow.
And just, if God is a present help in trouble, what does it mean for adoptees? Is this something that we're even allowed to work through and pray through and ask for help about? So I eventually initiated a search for my birth family, and they located her. That was about a 4 or 5 year search. And I ended up in Korea. I spent winter break there. One of my best friends from high school was teaching English at a hagwon, and I was able to stay with him. And that was my whole reunion experience. And just even being in Korea was a reunion kind of experience for me, just to like be in community with people who look like me was like an out of this world experience. Right.
Wow.
And so through all of that, and I can speak more to this as we go on here, but it wasn't a fully happy celebratory, like, oh, you see these reunions on Good Morning America and it's tears and everyone's hugging. It was a lot different than that, and I was kind of blindsided by it. And thankfully, I had this sort of re-entry into the church, and I was, kind of like my faith was being rebuilt, I think, during that time. And I had friends that I had made through working at the adoptee camps, and I was able to kind of dialogue back and forth with them as a form of support. But when I got back to campus after that reunion trip, really discovering this is a very personal, but it's like this living mission. And Dr. Judith Herman calls it a survivor's mission. But in her book Trauma Recovery, she's a trauma researcher, scholar. She says something like nothing can compensate for an atrocity, but a lot of times survivors can transform it into, she calls it a survivor's mission. But basically I was like, yo, God, like I'm not going to claim to know why or how, or just your purposes for why my life is like this. And what am I going to do with this? And I talked to my advisor and he said, have you ever considered being a mental health counselor? And it just clicked. And I started applying to grad schools and everything lined up. I had so many helpers during that time willing to write me letters of recommendation, guide me through the entire process. And that was my clinical training, counseling psychology. And even through that season of being licensed and finding my place in the clinical setting was really God's handling, just when I look back on it. And so that's the work that I do now. And I'm still learning because a lot of the ideas that I'm exploring and presenting to the community are new, just as they were new to me when my supervisor said he's looking for his birth mom. Well, I was there too. I didn't know anyone would want to do that. Yeah. But here I am years after my own search. Let's talk. Wow. And how can I cheer for you? And that's really where I'm at today.
Wow. Cameron, what I love about your story, as you were just kind of sharing it, there's so many different facets I love about your story, but what you mentioned right there at the end about this survivor's mission, it's very akin to what we talk about a lot at Nothing is Wasted Ministries. We have a course called Pain to Purpose. And that's the whole idea, is how do you discover God's redemptive plan, the purposes he's building around the pain that you've gone through, and maybe equipping you in a way that you would have not otherwise been equipped because of the pain that you walked through, right? This is the redemptive thing that God does in all of our pain. And you're living that out, every single day right now. And for some people like you and me, it turns into a calling or career change or different things like that, where you step into a different convergence of your life. For other people, it's, finding small moments of what may seem insignificant, but really significant, meaningful moments where they can minister and help other people. But it's such a cool thing to see that this is what you're doing now to help others. And you're trying to create resources and be a resource in ways that you didn't necessarily have those resources, and in ways that a lot of people don't have those resources. And I'd love to kind of draw some of that out of you, just clinically speaking. Loss or adoption comes rooted in loss. And I know that, for me, I can speak to what is it like to lose a loved one that's really close to you. But there's a deep sense of loss, that's different, but still very deep for someone who has been adopted, whether they've been adopted at birth or whether, in your situation, a few years later. Can you explain that a little bit? Help all of us be a little bit more informed of what that sense of loss looks like. How does it manifest itself with someone who's an adoptee?
Yeah. As you were talking right there, Davey, I remember I was giving a presentation at one of the culture camps. It was a Korean culture camp. And after my presentation, because I was talking about loss and trauma and healing and empowerment, and a grandmother came up to me and asked, sir, that was a wonderful presentation and thank you so much. But why would you come back here to talk about this sort of painful material? Mm. And I kind of look around at the campers. And they also have a day camp. So, we've got like first graders through sixth grade just running around, laughing, having a great time. And I'm like, for them, I'm going back in for the others, essentially, right? Yeah. And that's that survivor's mission, because there might be a time in little Johnny's life where he has some questions that aren't so easily answered. And if I can help give the parents that he loves and trusts tools or maps or compasses and resources to say, hey, we've actually talked about this, little Johnny, let's sit together. That's my heart, so that's why I want to come back and talk about this. Now, the loss piece, I think one of the first hurdles for me personally was that adoption even is connected to loss. Mm. Because when I was growing up, I guess I just assumed that I was kind of saved from a very dark, terrible circumstance and dark future. That's what I had grown up believing myself. Right. And after, I guess like the humanization of the Asian community for me, like with the church and everything, I started to explore, well, maybe there are some valuable pieces to Asian culture and even my birth family that may have been worth something, and maybe something beyond my imagination. So it was exploring, how do I guess like challenge with love some of these narratives, like you were rescued, you were saved, you're lucky to be adopted. And that's part of that process. So, when I think back to, I look at my picture in the foster home with my foster mom, just thinking about language, community, the connections, the familiarity, the sensory input, the atmosphere, the environment of the people around me. I'm talking about like legacy and traditions and camaraderie, fellowship, just all of these different cultural pieces that, in a sense, kind of go away once I get in that red Volvo and drive to the middle of Wisconsin with my new mom and dad. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean that my adoptive parents were intentionally saying, let's go ahead and erase this kid's culture as much as possible. Yeah. That's not their heart. It was more of, well, in the middle of Wisconsin, there's a lot of cheese, but not a lot of kimchi, Not a lot of there's no place to buy Korean food, bulgogi. No one's speaking Korean, and that's not their fault, but that's just the reality of it.
Yeah. By the way, that's a
And
shame because if you're going without bulgogi or kimchi in life, you need to check
Davey
yourself.
knows.
I know.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. So that's I mean, and I don't want to be mistaken. I'm not saying that, hey, if there's a child who needs warmth and comfort and care and a roof over their head and stability, I'm not saying we should deny them that. So that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying though is that loss piece is significant. I don't think God counts that as insignificant, that I'm connected to a family constellation, some of them still alive in Korea. And I don't think God discounts them as they live today with this very hour, right? And that's the piece that I had to reconcile when I started attending the Asian American church. Do I pray for my birth family? Is it still okay to ask about them or wish good things upon them and maybe even participate in that?
Wow.
There's that sense. And then there was another, I guess, kind of like loss in terms of the loving my neighbor as significant when I'm growing up. And again, not that anyone is intentionally teaching me this, but I'm growing up thinking, I'm very glad that I am in America, that I'm an American, because this is like the place to be on earth. We know how to do things around here. And I'm so thankful that I'm not over there in Asia where they do things like they do, because it's just not as good. It's inferior in so many ways. And I had a lot of internalized racism, a lot of self-hatred there.
Wow.
I had to unpack that because, well, now my pastor is Korean American. How do I reconcile this? I'm hearing from God through my pastor, and yet so much of my life has been saturated with how Asians are represented on TV, broken English, who make fun of them. They're only good at the stereotypes, right? But now learning how to submit to authority in this context, it was just, there was a lot of unpacking to do and repacking, relearning. So the loss of that is saying that, I've said this before in other contexts, like with a funeral, we don't walk up to the widow and say, just think of everything that you've gained. And to adoptees, we don't want to say to a grieving adoptee who's grieving the loss of their birth culture, birth family, possibilities, legacy, future, all that. We don't want to just say, well, look at the loving family that you have now. Look at the opportunities and the potentials that you've been granted through adoption. Just focus on that. No, we're saying, gosh, especially when we think about ambiguous loss, the loss of a significant loved one, for an adoptee is that, there's a significant person who is physically absent and yet psychologically present. Psychologically present meaning, I wonder what life would be like if I grew up with my mom. Or is my mom thinking about me right now? What was my dad like? Did he hold me? When my son was born, and just all my children, but I'm just most recent when my son was born, just holding my son. And did my dad ever hold me like this? What was it like in the delivery room, right?
Wow.
And what we allow children, how that can manifest, if a child is crying uncontrollably or they're quote unquote misbehaving, when I work with adoptive parents, it's just broaching the idea. Well, I'm not going in guns blazing. There's no criticism. We're not blaming or condemning anyone. We're asking, if you were at a funeral and the bereaved, the widow has lots of different emotions, immediately you'd say like, someone they care about has just passed away, has died, and they're grieving. Now, just because your adoptee is 3 years old and they're having a tantrum, quote unquote tantrum, in the grocery store, and I'm not saying that we're making everything about adoption. I'm not blaming everything on adoption. I'm just saying that when I work with parents, we're broaching the concept of how do we widen the scope of what grieving looks like on the outside? because a child, pre-verbal, they don't have the ability to put that into words.
Yeah.
I was 3.5, and my parents said that like my adoptive mom, she'd go into the grocery store, and I would cry the whole time she's in there. Why? Because in some ways, little 3.5-year-old Cam not only is trying to figure out, okay, number one, what happened to my first mom? Number two, I've been living with this other foster Oma for 6 months. What happened to her and them? Number three, now this woman is walking away. I don't know she's going grocery shopping. My amygdala is just going beep, 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 beep.
Right.
I'm really waiting for the other shoe to drop, because the last time I got put into a car, I was flown across the ocean and I had no clue what was going on. So every time someone puts me in a car or an airplane or something, I'm thinking, here we go again.
Yeah.
Get ready for this, right? And it takes a long, and even as an adult, you know, now learning as a clinician, I understand why my body reacts the way it does, even as an adult sometimes, because there are these residual, the impact of trauma. They say, I think Gabor Mate says something like, trauma is what happens inside of us. The event is traumatic. He says a lot of people think trauma is the parents' divorce, the abuse, the fighting, the separation. That event is traumatic, but the trauma is what happens inside the body. So for me, that happened inside my body, and it makes sense why I was my attachment style to my adoptive parents was a little complicated because it didn't really know it. It kind of senses threat in a very different way. Wow. So the loss of stability, the loss of control, the loss of safety, the loss of trust in adults, the loss of continuity, what happened these first 3.5 years of my life, loss of innocence, loss of communication in a way. I mean, of course, I was 3.5. I was speaking Korean, but now I have to like sort of relearn a lexicon to get my needs met. In order to survive in this new environment, I have to relinquish everything that I thought the world was and really just be super observant of what these people are doing around me. My mom and dad are probably trying to tell me something. I don't know what they're saying. It's going in one ear and I'm like, I'm really hungry. Or I'm really sad, but they don't know what to do. Right. So that's part of the loss. The hope is that we're researching this more now. There are tangible resources, tangible tools, and new perspectives, and, you know, trauma-informed, adoptee sensitive perspectives that can provide families with restorative guidance. Not that we can wave a magic wand and say it's all going to be perfect, because we still live in this world, but there are new ways to walk alongside children and families who are going through this. So that's how we sort of help name the loss, just broaching everything that we just shared here, and then saying, I'm here with you. Wow. Let's co-create the path forward together. Trusting that God is also a very present help in trouble.
Wow. That's a really difficult thing. You know, I know personally, as we're helping our kids navigate the complexities of their stories and how their body, even pre-verbal, right? The stuff that has happened to them, the transitions that's happened to them, and how their body is manifesting that now, and the confusion, the complexities of that. Maybe speak a little bit to how can we as parents, as we're widening the scope, to think and consider, wait, maybe there's something broader regarding loss here. How do we discern what is trauma related, loss related versus what is like your quote unquote typical childhood behavior type stuff? You know, is there any helpful way to draw those lines up a little bit more?
Yeah. I think that is one of the most difficult parts about the field of counseling as it is. And I mean, I what I hear is the question of like, how do we tell what's potentially like a biologically rooted sort of like trauma kind of thing versus maybe even typical developmental behavior, and then sin.
Right.
You know, I think Paul Tripp says something like part of a parent's job is to like rescue a child from themselves, their own heart, their sin, right? And teaching how to connect them with Christ, who saves us from that. And I don't have the crystal clear answer. I'm walking through this with you. What I can share is that the resources that have been most helpful to me as a clinician are ones that do account for the biological piece as well. But then also we're helping, essentially what my hope is to do is help children who are doing that. We're providing psychoeducation in an age appropriate level. We're providing gospel informed resources at an age appropriate level so that they can kind of like do that discernment within themselves in their own personal vertical relationship with the Lord.
Wow.
And that's we're really trying to like teach a person how to fish. Like I can give you the fish and say, you felt really sad and that's why you hit your little brother. Well, I don't know if that's really true, but I'm helping narrate. I'm giving you some ideas, but I'm like giving you the words, and then you can give me feedback. Maybe my daughter can say, "No, that's not how I felt." But we're modeling the dialogue, and then we're teaching them that what there's this kind of line. What was going on in your heart? What did you want in that moment? Well, I wanted that toy. Okay. Well, maybe did that toy remind you of something? Did it activate sort of like an unnameable groan that's too deep for words?
Wow.
Associated with adoption-related loss? Or was it you love that toy so much you're willing to do wrong things in order to get it? Where the toy starts ruling your heart. It has hijacked you. The toy's good. I think Paul Tripp again says something like a good thing becomes a bad thing when it becomes a ruling thing.
Yeah.
So helping my children kind of see that. But then the nuance to this, when I was in Korea, well, when I first got there, after a few days, my mom canceled the meeting. So here I am. I'm like, I thought I was about to meet my birth mom. I'm in Korea now, and why doesn't she want to meet me? I was devastated. And there's all sorts of like rejection again, abandonment. I'm not worthy. Why am I even here? Why are you doing this to me, God? And I'm not saying that in that moment, I loved my birth mom more than God, or I love the reunion so much that it's, it's a barrier to my faith. The nuance, though, is saying that for adoptees, we do want to have that dialogue about what does it mean to think about birth family or birth culture or these disconnections.
Yeah.
Anyway, so back to your question, like how do we know in that moment? I think what's important is that we may not know right now in this moment. What I teach my families, though, is that when it's on your radar, though, you're in a better posture to have empathy and compassion. And there's the Dr. Becky Kennedy is the founder of Good Inside. And her idea is essentially in these moments of emotion dysregulation for our children, we're going to say to ourselves, she's a good kid having a hard time. Now, listeners, you're listening to that and you can put whatever theological legs you want. All I'm saying, though, is when you can say, hey, he's a good kid having a hard time right now. He's a good kid having a hard time. She calls it the most generous interpretation.
Yeah, that's good.
So I don't want to sometimes as a parent, I'm going to get triggered and say, oh my gosh, if I don't lay down some heavy discipline right now, he's going to grow up to be so disrespectful and selfish and entitled and get everything he wants. But that's my amygdala. I have flipped my lid. And now my ability to provide soothing, bigger, wiser, stronger, kind connection, that's been impeded. That's been hijacked. So what I want to do is I'm working with parents to say, what can you do in these moments to preserve that consideration that your child has complexities that they're holding. And right now, probably the most important thing for you to do is provide some connection, that I'm here with you and we're going to get through this together. Right now, especially while you're crying in the sort of dysregulation, right now is not the time for me to give you the lecture. Your brain cannot process a long string of words. Okay. We're going to use short sentences, positive eye contact, soothing touch, if touch is associated with positive connection. And we're going to get down on their level and we're going to essentially incarnate the presence of a good, loving, wise God right there in the moment. Now that's hard to do sometimes, but that's sort of like the posture. And it turns out that the soothing presence is actually part of trauma-informed care, because the body is, I mean, we've got, they call it the sympathetic nervous system, fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, right? And the quickest way and the reason we're in that fight, flight, freeze response is because the amygdala in the limbic system has taken over, which means the front part of our brain, and you all know this, and maybe for listeners too, the executive functioning that happens in the front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, right behind our forehead, that has been compromised somehow. Okay. So there's this book that everyone can look at. It's called Hey Warrior, and it talks about this in a very child-friendly way. And the best way to reactivate your amygdala, reactivate the executive functioning is oxygen. Quickest way, the best way to do that is deliver, we call it like send your amygdala a message that says we're safe. You can thank your amygdala and say, wow, thank you for trying to keep me safe. You're doing a wonderful job and I'm okay. So you can go back to taking a rest. But we're delivering oxygen to the brain. So breathe in through the nose, and then we're exhaling carbon dioxide out of our mouth. So I teach my children, smell the flowers, blow out the birthday candles. Now, if you didn't know the science behind that, you'd think, okay, that's kind of lame. What is this hippy dippy stuff? But when you know the science behind it, in the moment of dysregulation, well, now your job as a parent is to help you know that you're trying to reactivate their executive functioning and you're trying to activate their parasympathetic nervous system. That's the calming part. And so all the parents here who's taken David's course, you already know that there are these biological things happening. That's what we're trying to do. But with trauma, adoption literacy helps children understand this as they grow up, so that eventually, like, they've got this trail of open-ended, non-judgmental dialogue with their parents who are teaching them, this is what's going on in your body. And yes, this is also what's going on in your heart and your soul, but this is what's going on in your body right now. And practically speaking, here are 3 options that you can do to bring your body back to a place of presence, of mindfulness, of planning, morality, pro-social decision-making. So that's part of our work together. And I know that's, I went off on a tangent.
Oh, that's amazing. No, it's a great tangent.
All of those things, we're here together as a community working on that.
That was so helpful, Cameron. Like, for all of us, especially those of us who are parents who are helping our kids to navigate this, so important. So important for those of us who know it, even to be reminded of this, because when you're in the trenches every single day, it's so easy to, as you said, flip your lid, to go back into your own fight or flight when you're trying to deal with the hustle and bustle of getting kids ready for school and all this kind of stuff. It can get really chaotic, and you can forget that calming presence is the most important thing that we can provide for them, no matter what their lived experience is. And that's the best way that we can model the incarnational presence, the ministry of presence that Jesus gave us as well. Yes. I love that one day I was driving the car, as a little anecdote, and sitting behind me is he was 4 at the time, 5-year-old son now. And I kept hearing, just like you were talking about, smell the flowers, blow out I look back and I go, Cohen, what are you doing? He goes, I'm calming my body right now. Yeah. Well, his mom has taught him this is, if you get dysregulated, which he has a huge personality, a big temper. And so he's like, okay, I'm just going to calm my body. And I think that's such a helpful thing to even equip our kids with that kind of language, that kind of practice, to help them downregulate as they're trying to figure out the complexities of their own emotions right now.
Yeah. And it's amazing that aspect of co-regulation is the trust that I can do this with my caregiver, that I trust that they are cheering for me, they're rooting with me. And when I need help, when the demands exceed my ability to do this, well, gosh, I turn toward the one that I love, and they're going to help me.
Yeah.
I have confidence they're going to help me. Now, we're not perfect as parents, but that's part of that's part of the journey that we're trying to build together.
Man, that's so good. That's so good. What would you say to the person who is, especially in like evangelical Christian circles? I mean, there's a couple of things that I'd love to tackle. One, let's start first with this. What would you say to the person who is considering adoption? They're like, hey, this is a route that we feel like God is leading us to. This is something that we're wanting to dive into. It can feel like this on some level, this glorious calling where you are rescuing a child from exactly what you were saying earlier, like rescuing a child from the experience that they were going to have. And so now we're stepping in, and it's going to be, and it can be very idyllic oftentimes. And I would assume that you would probably want to give people a little bit more of a dose of reality, and at the same time talk about the significance and meaning of what they are stepping into, the call that they're stepping into. But what would you, if you're sitting down with somebody who's they're considering adoption, what would you say to them?
Mm-hmm. I have a 12-week education support thing that I walk through. I'm going to do my best to kind of pull from that here. And
what is that called, by the way? We need to put that resource on here. That'd be great to connect people with it.
Oh, sure. That's called the Adoptive Parenting Consultation Group, and that's open to loved ones, foster caregivers, pre-adoption, post-adoption. But the reason I mentioned that is because, there is so much, and there's a reason why adoption agencies and child welfare organizations do such a home study process leading up to it. Because, what I would say is we really want to ensure that in that home study process, formally, but also especially informally, that parents are examining their heart and being honest about what potential limitations, assumptions, biases, what learning they need to do or they're going to want to do to better equip them, just to be really honest about it. And, one of the unfortunate things that I've seen, just in the past decade or 15 years or so, is like, yes, there can be a glorious calling for this individual family who's folded within a church community. But if that church community, I guess I want to frame it like this, Davey, when that church community is also trauma informed and adoptee informed, then that family is going to be surrounded by communion and support and resources, love, empathy, sensitivities, dignity, respect. And that kind of environment, and an adoptee and an adoptive family are going to be better positioned to thrive and walk through some tough seasons that don't always have clear answers. And they're going to be supported and connected, and they trust that the leaders around them are also cheering for them, also advocating to the best that they can. Why? To help serve that family in their glorious calling.
Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that was going to be the second part of my question, was how do we support family, right? So keep going, man. That's great. You went ahead and dove into that. And
the fact that, and I want to be careful too, because again, we're not here to point fingers and say, the last thing I want is a listener to be like, oh my goodness, my pastor is not doing that. I must be at a horrible church. No, I think maybe part of the thing is like your church is maybe new to the conversation, right? But actually, I'm not going to cut them off. We actually want to invite more churches into the conversation. Yeah. And so I want to have that heart of like, how do we just calling in, providing more knowledge, because the most generous interpretation for a church would be if they knew some more just information and had a little bit more access to the nuances here, they would be eager. They would be running. They'd be hungry to get trauma-informed adoptee-informed resources into their church community. I don't think there are churches that are maliciously trying to say, no, we don't want to learn more about how to serve our shepherd our sheep. That should be pretty rare. But most likely it's like, how can we just present some of this information in more of an accessible way to meet churches where they're at, so that they're more equipped to serve those families within the congregation who are adopting. So if I was to say something to a family, yes, your immediate sort of like internal, local, like your heart, your family, why are you adopting? Are you prepared? All of these different things, but then also outward into the community. if I am your adoptee, let's roll the tape forward 3 years from now. And what's my experience going to be like when I walk into the doors of your small group or your church or your Bible study? How am I going to feel? What's the environment like? What's the ideology of the folks around us? We're not trying to like get divisive or anything like that, but I'm just saying, like in the perspective of like your adoptee and you as a family, when you're in the throes of parenting, can you call up a brother or sister in Christ and be like, yo, I need to talk, and not have them say, what do you mean? Just pray more. No, but have them say, come on over, or let me cook some food, bring it over to you right now. Let me sit with the kids. You go out, or you go take a nap, like just
Right.
the last thing we want is for a church to pressure their congregants to adopt, but then just leave them hanging afterwards,
Right.
and almost criticize them for not being good parents. And that, unfortunately, that's been some of the testimonies of the parents that I've worked with that brought them to my clinic in the first place.
Yeah.
So normalizing that before we even bring this child into our home.
Yeah, that's so good. I think the last thing I'd love to explore, Cameron, is, we've got folks who are listening to this and they are themselves adoptees. And I would say let's categorize them. They're adult adoptees. And maybe they haven't, just like you, early on, they didn't have this kind of language or resourcing, but now they're grappling with some things and they're really trying to untangle a lot of the complexities of their lived experience, their past, they're trying to figure this out and process through it. How would you advise them? What would be either some resources that you guys have that you would connect them with, or what would be some like advice if you're having coffee with someone across the table and you had a couple of minutes to say, hey, here's what I want to encourage you with?
There are, thankfully, in 2024 here, there are 20 to 30 adoptee-led organizations, created by adult adoptees. And those are like hyperlinks to, they've got meetups, they've got virtual roundtables, they've got resources, they've got mental health articles, they've got videos, they've got online courses. I'm going to send those to you, Davey, so that they can just go right to your site. They're on my site too, just all of that. I would say that's a great entry point, because you might feel kind of isolated. I felt isolated. Like, am I going crazy here? But when I got plugged in to an adult adoptee community, not just to say, oh my goodness, we've got so much pain for the sake of just saying that, but hope moves forward to say, yes, there is some pain here. How can we collaborate to do something about it? And there's this phase of adoptee consciousness. It's a 5-point phase, but the 5th phase is called forgiveness and activism. And what it says, hey, my parents or the people around me did the best they could with what they had at the time. And now how can I invest in my own growth, my own healing? For those who are, listening with a faith perspective, how do you participate with God in that? And how, if you feel compelled, how do you participate in Survivor's Mission that addresses the systemic potential, like institutional layers, if that's a meaning for you? And there are ways. So those adoptee-led organizations, for me, it took me a while to get it out of my head that therapy is a normal life-giving procedure, even within the church. I think you've referenced the Christian Counseling Education Foundation. But I took some training from that community, and it was so refreshing to be validated in the sense that in the local church, there is a place for mental health support. It's like, yay, awesome. And they've made a whole like school out of this. That's incredible. So helping folks know, if you do bring in a faith background, that there are biblical counselors and adoptee informed, willing to dialogue about this with you. And just that core piece of, you're not alone. Your story matters. God does not consider your story insignificant. He's here working for you right now. And just the last thing, I think it was the podcast interview with Paul Tripp here with Nothing is Wasted. He says something like, we often think prayer is like, we pray and the firefighters are activated. They slide down the pole. They come to our help. He's like, no, prayer is actually, God is already working in your life right now. So once you grapple with that and trust that, it makes this process, it just puts a different frame on that. God is already present before I've even reached out to these 20 websites, you know, and make no mistake, God is very interested in our flourishing. It's not like God's trying to like stop you from healing. Like, no, that's not the way. Anyway, that's where I'd start, and I'll send you those resources, Davey. And I've got resources on my site, Therapy Redeemed, Instagram at Therapy Redeemed is my handle, and really just normalizing the conversation. I think that's just my heart to say that it takes a village to relinquish a child and another one to keep them from talking about what happened, but we can be a different kind of village. Tell us your story. Let's walk together, find healing and hope together. That's why we're here.
Wow. I love that. That's so good. We'll put all those resources in the show notes here. If you're listening on a podcast platform, if you're watching on YouTube, we'll make sure that we put the links right below this. But Cameron, this has been an incredible conversation. I'm just so grateful for you. I'm grateful for the work that you're doing, the content that you're putting out there, the time that you've spent with us. Thank you for being so thoughtful and vulnerable with your own story. And we're just really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for facilitating such a warm and thoughtful conversation, Davey, and your willingness to have me on. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode of the Nothing is Wasted podcast. We hope you enjoyed our conversation and found it as encouraging and insightful as we did. Now, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen, and leave us a rating and review. Your feedback helps us to connect to those who need these stories of hope and healing most, and to reach more listeners just like you. Also, subscribe to our Nothing is Wasted Ministries YouTube channel. Now be sure to stay connected with us on social media. You can follow us at Nothing is Wasted Ministries. Follow me at Davey Blackburn. We'd love to interact with you, so be sure to stop by and let us know how these conversations are impacting you and your story. And if you want to learn more about all the incredible resources we have available to help you navigate whatever valley you're walking through, visit our website at nothingiswasted.com. If you're ready to get started in your journey towards healing and finding purpose in your pain, we'd love to help. Simply go to nothingiswasted.com/start here for your next step. We want to thank our guests, and we want to thank you, our Nothing is Wasted community, for tuning in regularly. Remember, no matter what challenges you face, whatever pain you are walking through, nothing is wasted. We'll see you next time for another incredible conversation here on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. But before you go, check out this short clip from our next episode. Thanks for joining us, friends.
Indeed. I think for me, one of the things I took solace in, and we wrote about it, we wrote about Mother Teresa and how in her journey, I mean, she, in her journal, poured it out, and she did not hold back of the doubts and the anguish that she had, hoping and praying that this work, this incredibly difficult work she'd poured her life into, was going to be worth it. And that, like, is God even there? I mean, it was worth it because she loved and valued these people, but that sense of, is he up there for real? Because why is he so distant? And all of that pain that was there. And to see her continue on. And that's the story of so many of those who have gone before us. That's the story of so many of our, grandparents who have walked with God for a long, long time and walked through that hardship. And that's not to minimize what I have dealt with, but it just shows, there is plenty of precedent for people who have walked and kept on.
Yeah, that's good. Catherine, what about you?
Yeah, I love that. I would echo too, and like Jason said, we did write about this, like looking for kind of heroes of the faith that aren't the people who are being talked about on the news today, they're long dead and gone, but they were faithful in quieter ways than maybe we look at today.